This is the presentation over period 4, which covers the presidency of Thomas Jefferson through Andrew Jackson. It covers the years 1800 to 1848. And we're going to start by looking just at the political aspects of this era. It really is broken into 3 distinct time periods. You have the Age of Jefferson, you have the era of good feelings, and then you have the Age of Jackson. So let's start with Thomas Jefferson. What do we remember about him? Thomas Jefferson is elected in 1800 at a time where the United States is incredibly divided between 2 political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans, which Thomas Jefferson is the head of that party, believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which means if the Constitution doesn't say it, the federal government shouldn't be allowed to do that. Thomas Jefferson believes, according to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, that those powers belong to the states. Thomas Jefferson also had a vision of the nation as that of an agricultural country where most people would be working as farmers. This is an opposite to Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist Party that believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution as mandated by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that said that the federal government had the authority to pass any legislation that they deemed was necessary and proper for the authority of the federal government. This is manifested most basically in the Bank of the United States because Alexander Hamilton and his vision of the nation was that of an industrial country. So Thomas Jefferson wins a very contentious election, even within his own party. It goes 30 ballots in the House of Representatives when he ties with his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr. Eventually, the tie is broken in the Congress, and Thomas Jefferson is president and Aaron Burr is vice president. In 1803, these beliefs that Thomas Jefferson has held during his entire campaign are challenged when he's given the opportunity to purchase Louisiana from the French, which would effectively double the United States. This will allow him to have a farming republic. All that land that he could sell to help pay off debts would also benefit his idea of an agrarian nation. The problem is the Constitution does not give the president the power to purchase land. That's a power that's given to Congress. So he had to find a loophole. He violated his own strict interpretation of the Constitution by making a treaty to purchase land from France. The other thing that will challenge Thomas Jefferson's viewpoint once he's in office is the Barbary Pirates are still at play. And he finds out that George Washington and John Adams had been paying bribes to the pirates, which he will also continue to do, which goes against his idea of shrinking the size and the expenditures of the federal government. One of the biggest challenges, though, is going to be in the place of John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He is appointed at the last moment, along with many other Federalist judges, by John Adams as he's leaving office to be a check to Thomas Jefferson against his removing all of these different Federalist policies. And the biggest challenge is in a law case known as Marbury versus Madison that also took place in 1803. It challenged Thomas Jefferson's beliefs that he had written about in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that said because the states had ratified the Constitution, it should be the state legislatures that get to deem a law as constitutional or unconstitutional. Well, in 1803, John Marshall gives a ruling in the case of Marbury versus Madison that says, indeed, it is not the states, but the Supreme Court of the federal government that should get to rule laws as constitutional or unconstitutional. That power that has been the authority of the Supreme Court ever since 1803 is established, expanding the power of the federal government during Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican who had been seeking to limit the powers of the federal government. John Marshall, during his tenure as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, will, through his decisions, continue to strengthen the authority of the federal government in interstate commerce, in deciding the constitutionality of laws, and in other powers of the federal government as superior over the states. Another foreign policy challenge that Thomas Jefferson had to deal with was the impressment of American sailors. England was violating our neutrality. They were taking American sailors off of American ships and forcing them to join the British Navy. This impressment angered many supporters of Thomas Jefferson, and there were several who were calling for us to go to war. When Thomas Jefferson leaves office in 1808, he is followed by his second vice president, which is a man by the name of James Madison, father of the Constitution. And he will listen to these war hawks that are predominantly in southern and western states, and he will go to war with England in 1812. He'll ask Congress for a declaration of war. And for 2 years, we will fight the British. And in 1814, we will negotiate a peace treaty. When the war is over, its surprising effects are an increased amount of trade between us and Britain. We are able to put old differences aside, and our manufacturing will grow to meet these new markets in England. We'll also have increased patriotism. For all intents and purposes, we're 2-0. We've defeated Britain again. And thirdly, we weakened the Native Americans that had fought with the British in the Ohio River Valley. They're defeated, and this has an impact because Americans will continue to move west, and they'll feel more confident and secure that they'll be able to do that without the attacks of American Indians on their homesteads. This begins the new era that's known as the era of good feelings because 1, we're patriotic. 2, we're financially secure. And 3, the country is growing. So James Monroe will run without a Federalist opponent in 1820, meaning we're also united in our political perspectives for a brief period of time under a Democratic-Republican administration. Monroe will also exert the authority of the United States within our hemisphere. He will continue on with the foreign policies of isolation from Europe and European political affairs with the Monroe Doctrine, where he says, we will stay out of European affairs if you stay out of American affairs. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine says that any further colonial action by European powers in North or South America will be viewed as the United States as hostile, and we will defend the interests of the Western Hemisphere. We become the big brother of the era. The population of the United States at this time continues to grow. 90% of the population still lives in rural areas. Most of those people are involved in farming. However, there are increased numbers of people who are coming to urban centers to get jobs in the growing industry, most of them European immigrants. Matter of fact, between 1800 and 1840, the population of the United States will more than triple from 5 million to over 17 million residents. You also see the addition of new states west of the original 13 colonies, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. Eventually, by 1820, Missouri and Maine are the most recent states that are added. And in 1824, we start to see the beginning of the end of this era of good feelings, because we will again become politically divided over the results of the election of 1824, where the winner of the popular vote and the winner of the electoral votes, Andrew Jackson, will not become president because he did not have a majority in the Electoral College, meaning over half. Therefore, it went to the House of Representatives as decided by the Constitution, and Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who had finished 4th in the voting, will sway the electorate behind John Quincy Adams, who had been previously Secretary of State under James Monroe. And John Quincy Adams will become the 6th President of the United States. This causes Andrew Jackson to question the motives of the government and saying that he was discriminated against because of his popularity with the people and that he was not a government elite, because John Quincy Adams had been the son of former President John Adams. This is made worse when Henry Clay is then made Secretary of State, which causes Andrew Jackson to refer to this as a corrupt bargain. For the next 4 years, he will actively campaign for changes to the electoral process, which takes place through state laws that will expand the electorate into all white men instead of white men who own land. And as he positioned himself as the people's candidate, eventually in 1828, he's overwhelmingly elected as the people's president. He is the first president from a Western state. He's from Tennessee. He is a Revolutionary War and War of 1812 hero. He is a landowner, a plantation owner, and he was very stubborn. Matter of fact, his former soldiers underneath his command referred to him as Old Hickory. He's very similar to Jefferson in the idea that he's supported by farmers and that he believes in expanding democracy. However, he understands the necessity for industrial growth. He believed in a limited government with a strong executive branch. And this is going to be one of the defining powers of Andrew Jackson's presidency. When states try to cancel a law in 1832 in South Carolina, he will contradict them, and the idea of nullification that is expanded by his former vice president, John C. Calhoun, by saying, no, the federal government has the authority in these issues, not the states. Matter of fact, when South Carolina tries to cancel a law and secede in 1833, Andrew Jackson will threaten to send the army in to force them to follow the law of the compromise or the tariff of 1832. Henry Clay will be the person who comes up with a compromise tariff that resolves the issue. The other place where Andrew Jackson exerts his authority is with the Second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson did not believe that the Bank of the United States was constitutional. And when Nicholas Biddle in 1832 tried to renew the charter of the bank, which did not expire until 1836, 4 years early, Andrew Jackson vetoes it. And Nicholas Biddle felt like this would be the moment where Andrew Jackson would not be reelected, that the American public would see the necessity for the Bank of the United States and not in Andrew Jackson's plan of killing the bank. The public disagreed with Nicholas Biddle, and Andrew Jackson is overwhelmingly reelected in 1832. Andrew Jackson said, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. But when the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society have a right to complain of the injustice of their government." So what did Andrew Jackson do? After he was elected, he took all of the money out of the Bank of the United States, moved the money to state banks, states in mostly western and southern states that had supported him in his reelection. And when the Bank of the United States no longer had any funds in it, it could no longer function. After 1836, when the Bank of the United States charter is no longer there, we have not had a Bank of the United States since. This led some people to refer to Andrew Jackson as King Andrew. Matter of fact, the National Republicans who had supported John Quincy Adams in his election in 1824 renamed their party the Whig Party, which is a tip of the hat to people in Britain who had been against the powers of the monarchy abusing their power. So one of the legacies of Andrew Jackson is that he extended the power and expanded the power of the president in all matters of the federal government. Another legacy is that he was able to pay off the debt of the United States. However, the actions that he took after he led office would lead to states not being able to regulate or control equally all of the different responsibilities that had previously been managed by the Second Bank of the United States. This will lead to inflation. This will lead to speculators taking advantage of these state banks, and eventually in 1837, under new President Martin Van Buren, one of the worst financial crises that this country still to this day has ever endured, known as the Panic of 1837.